the fact that something is written into a treaty is not enough to ensure that it's respected in reality. So, if you have a rule of law system, if you're talking about sort of being able to go to British courts and getting them to uphold a right, yes, this is a country where the rule of law largely prevails. But even when there are issues that, are in debate and where the government is trying to change the law, those situations, public opinion matters. And you have to fight it out. You have to kind of try to shape public opinion. So it isn't just a matter of, shaming governments with conduct according to sort of static public opinion. You got to shape that public opinion. And obviously the far right is trying to do that by demonizing immigrants. People who, believe in the rights of anyone have to stress the right of people to flee persecution, the right of people to flee war. It doesn't mean that anybody can show up at the border and get admitted. If you're merely an economic migrant, you actually don't have the same rights under the law as somebody who is fleeing persecution or war. That may be an unfairness, but that is the reality of the law. But
I was going to say, is there a clear, bright line between an economic migrant and someone who is fleeing war or persecution?
There's not a clear line, but if you eliminated that line, you would no longer have a right to seek asylum. If the law was open borders, anybody can come, the law would be changed in 2 seconds. So I think this is just a compromise that, for better or worse, is necessary. That there's recognition that certain people do need protection, and that everybody has a duty, if they show up at their border, to provide a fair hearing and to make the determination: are you a mere economic migrant or are you fleeing persecution? And if it's somebody who's being persecuted, they need to be given a safe haven. Now, the prior British government, the Tory government, their answer was send them to Rwanda. That was so immoral because, Rwanda under Paul
and so expensive.
Well, leaving aside that, it was
expensive.
It was obviously, a bad deal for the British taxpayer, but it was also just, inhumane because Paul Kagame is running a brutal dictatorship in Rwanda, where any dissident faces at least imprisonment, if not assassination. This is the same guy who has now invaded eastern Congo by way of his M23 rebel proxy group, and just to get the minerals is forcing millions of people to live under this brutal force. And so this is a safe place to send asylum seekers.
And we just gave them, 175 million or something like that?
Which ended up, supporting their brutality. So, this was an utterly amoral approach by the prior British government, which fortunately has been abandoned now.
I want to get into this question of immigration a little bit more deeply, because one of the things that has played out time and time again in the UK context is that you will have a deportation flight of asylum seekers, an 11th hour court order saying, no, you can't do this. These people are, deserving of protection. You have to look at their cases on an individual basis. The government is in breach of the law in trying to deport these people. And then what the government either of the day has done or an opposition party has done is say, look, this is why we need to change the law because the court is getting in the way of us carrying out our mandate. You voted us in because we promised we were going to bring down immigration, and now they're stopping us from doing it. Human Rights Watch sits in this place where, yes, it uses the law, but you've also said that public perception and public opinion is really important. These are often political conflicts. You're appealing to people's morality. How do you thread that needle where you've got a court on one side, and in the UK, we don't have elected judges, and you have an elected government on the other saying we're carrying out our mandate?
Well, I think we have to recognize first that the concept of rights is meant as a constraint on the elected government. In other words, we don't live in a purely majoritarian system where whatever the majority wants goes. The whole idea of having rights is to recognize that there are certain limits on what the government can do. If the government votes to start summarily executing people it doesn't like, if it votes to start torturing people it doesn't like, it can't do that because of rights, because rights are a constraint on the government. In the realm of immigration, the constraints are actually pretty modest. It's just you have to provide a fair hearing for anybody who seeks asylum and determine in that hearing, are they fleeing war or persecution? If they are, they get to stay. If they're not, they can be deported. It's a simple matter. So the courts aren't blocking deportation of people who are mere economic migrants. Those can be sent back. But if somebody is in the UK to flee persecution or war, they're entitled to stay just as any other country in the world where this issue comes up. And so, and to be honest, to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights isn't going to change that because, Britain has joined the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as a member of the Refugee Convention. I mean, there's lots of law stating the same thing, which is you cannot send somebody back to a situation where they would face persecution. It's a pretty simple matter. It's not an open borders policy. It's a narrow exception to the rule that governments can control who enters their country.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for
Please.
a minute, and I'm going to quote somebody who I spoke to when I was doing a Vox Pop in East London, and I said, look, I understand that you're very against asylum seekers in the abstract, but what do you think when you see, at this time, this was during the Syrian refugee crisis, when you see a little boy, a little boy's body washed up on the beach? She said, I don't care. And she said, I don't care. And there are a growing number of people in this country who say, you're just trying to guilt me into a more permissive or liberal immigration system. And I don't want it. And I feel sad for those people, fine, but you can't weaponize their humanity against me. What happens when instead of people feeling like, hey, a rules-based international order is something I want to be a part of. Human rights, that's something I want to be a part of. What do you do when people go, actually, there's one law and it's called might is right, and I just want to be the stronger party?
Yeah. I mean, what you're describing is kind of the autocrats approach. This is the approach of Viktor Orban in Hungary. This is now the approach of Trump.
But also there are a sizable number of voters who feel that way.
Yes. And I mean, this is where the support for the far right comes in, whether it's Marine Le Pen in France or the AfD in Germany, or here in this country too. I mean, so there are people who feel that way. I don't quarrel with that. I think the way to fight back is, first of all, yes, you humanize the victims because, most people are not heartless in the face of tragedy, encountering somebody. But we also have to be clear about what's going on with the leaders who promote this kind of xenophobia, because classically, this is a way to change the subject. Why is Viktor Orban fixated on stopping immigration? Because he has nothing to show to the Hungarian people. This is a guy who uses the huge subsidies provided by the European Union every year to build football stadiums so he can pay off his cronies. This is an utterly corrupt regime where...
Look, man, Tottenham Hotspur got a brand new stadium and that made me very happy. Yeah. Maybe a different example.
But in other words, this is people who, demonize migrants, demonize Muslims, demonize gays, demonize feminists. There's always some angle. It's always to change the subject. It's a way to appeal to typically their ethnic majority working class base in a kind of, a discriminatory way, to forget the fact that the leader has no political program to actually better their lives. He's just, doing a sleight of hand to say it's all the fault of the immigrants. And so we have to point that out and to just kind of accept the debate on their terms. Oh, it's all about immigration is actually often to lose the debate. We have to point out that this focus on immigration is in lieu of an utter lack of a program to better the lives of even the working class people that they claim to support.
When you read opinion polls which show growing support for strong autocratic leaders, does that worry you?
Yes, it worries me. And indeed, it's something that we have to counter. What's interesting, if you look around the world, and I describe this in the book, people who live under autocrats almost uniformly want out. And we've seen this through, mass demonstrations that have popped up in one country after the other in recent years against autocracy in favor of democracy. And, sometimes they win. We got rid of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. We got rid of the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka. We got rid of the Law and Justice Party in Poland. There was recently a successful uprising against an attempted military coup in South Korea. There are big protests today against what, Erdogan is doing in Turkey, what the autocratic government in Serbia is doing, what in Indonesia they're trying to do to kind of militarize the civil service. So we see, throughout really the global South plus, we see a real affirmation of the importance of democracy. What is the problem today, ironically, is in the established democracies of the West. And here, I think, where you see the polling of people who prefer autocracy, these tend to be people who feel neglected and left behind.
What's democracy done for me?
Exactly. They don't feel served. They don't feel heard. They don't feel respected by this, seemingly elite democratic government. And these are the people who are ripe for the autocrats' appeal. And so the answer to this, I think, is foremost to ensure that democratic governments do a better job of serving everybody. And this has been, one of the problems with the preoccupation with sort of neoliberal economics, the assumption that if you just, grow the pie, if the economy keeps expanding, everybody will be better off. It's obviously not true. So people who live in the cities or are connected to their knowledge economy, they're doing great. But a lot of people who live in traditional working class societies, who maybe have been factory workers, they're hurting. They're stagnating at best. They're facing growing inequality. And so I think the challenge is to ensure that our governments, even in the West, are serving everybody. And that is, something that actually the autocrats are not doing. They're just very good at playing to this grievance to change the subject and to serve themselves.